I'm joined now by someone who has worked across many well-known films with the likes of The Muppets and more recently Steven Spielberg on the BFG. But all of that started off at the BBC VFX department. I'd like to introduce sculptor and visual effects designer Morag McLean. How are you?
I'm very well, thanks. How are you?
Thanks, and you making the most of these rather odd times. You're still busy sculpting and working?
I am, but I'm an artist now. I think I've retired. And it's, the whole life has been creative, so it's no problem to think about retirement and having nothing to do because I've got tons of stuff to do.
Oh, fantastic. But I wanted to take you back to sort of the start of it all at the BBC. How did you found yourself in the VFX department?
How did I find myself there? I told them I was the best thing since sliced bread and they needed a sculptor. And I told them, oh yeah, I know all about pyrotechnics, optics, mechanics, electronics, and yeah. But I kind of, I had a very good sculpting portfolio because I was a trained sculptor and they needed a sculptor at the time and they gave me the job. And I made sure the interview was all about sculpture. And so there wasn't much time left at the end to talk about the rest of the stuff that I really didn't know about. But, I learned it when I was on the job, the other things.
Because I get the impression that many in the department would be, experienced in everything. So was it quite unusual that you would be able to almost specialise then?
All of us didn't so much specialise at the BBC. We learned more, but most of us came with specialities. All of us, for the most part, we'd been to colleges, we'd had apprenticeships, we came trained already. And the rest of it we learned on the job, and we learned it from each other, as well as BBC training. For example, in visual effects, they trained us in pyrotechnics because that was incredibly important for health and safety and everything. But most of us came with skills of fantastic woodworkers, electronics. I was a sculptor, just right across the board. People who were quirky, had quirky minds about just how to make things, and it was wonderful. The creativity there was fabulous.
And I might think you'd been very quickly actually on to making shows or props for shows. There wasn't sort of a training period, as it were.
You're right. You were expected to perform. And I arrived as a sculptor, and immediately, although there was another sculptor there who was about to leave, I was given a project, and I had to make a realistic dummy that floated drowning in the river for, I think it was Mayor of Casterbridge, long time ago. And I had to make this dummy. It just said, you just get a dummy and throw it in the water, and it doesn't. No, it doesn't. If it's made of foam rubber, it'll float away, Not even, it'll be out the water, sitting on top of the water. You have to start balancing it and making a good face on it and everything like that. So that was my first one. I very quickly moved out of the sculpture department as such, because sculpture is not needed on every single show. And my work dried up, and I thought, what can I do? And there's a workbench out there in the big workshop, and nobody's got it, so I'm having it. And I moved all my tools out there, and I had only been there an hour and a half, and someone rushed up to me and said, we need a talking daffodil for the day after tomorrow. Can you make one? And I said, yes, of course I can. And then I had to think, right, how do I make that? But the quirkiness of all of that as a sculptor, I could make the daffodil, no problem. But how do I make it talk? A fishing line down the middle of the stem. And then I knew nothing about how to operate it remotely until someone said, ask Charlie Lum. And Charlie Lum was our go-to man for electronics. That was his speciality. And he had a cupboard full of radio control things, and he showed me how simple it was to use this. And immediately he showed me, I went, ding, light went on. Yep, I can do that. And I put this together, and off it went. I was actually allowed to go to set with it and operate it. And I was delighted when the audience fell about laughing, because it worked. So, yeah, everybody was thrown in at the deep end. You were, as an assistant, you know, and if someone knew how to do it and you didn't, they showed you what they wanted. But for the most part, no, I mean, who's made a talking daffodil before, you know? So I was very much, I said I could do it. So for the most part, I had to do it. And I did. Yay.
I suppose it's inevitable that you'd encounter Doctor Who at some point, because, you know, it was a big BBC visual effects department then.
None of us escaped it. It was, I lasted quite a long time with maybe just making a little prop here or there, a little bit of sculpture, and then hand it over, the crew take it on set, you know, the designer with the assistants take it on set, but I had just done a little thing. But then along came a Doctor Who, and I was working for Matt Irvin, the visual effects designer, and we made a Doctor Who blob, an amorphous blob, and there were other things to make on that Doctor Who as well. So, and that was a tough one. We never get a way out of it, you know. All of us were dragged into Doctor Who at some point or other.
I know you've talked a lot about errata, the sort of amorphous blob, but I think it's worth saying that the model shots in that of the jungle and the tar, you know, are beautifully done. So you would have been across everything, not just the blob, you know, model shots, pyrotechnics, all of it for that story.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, when you're creative, and as a sculptor, and all the other people as well, when you say make a model of a jungle that fits on an 8-foot by 8-foot tabletop, you're visually capable of seeing that in your mind. We were all artists to some degree of, or some speciality within being an artist. And so you know what you need. You know what you need to do. You know when you have to have it finished by, and you gather up all the things that you need. We had a fantastic stores department in our building. Our stores had every nut, bolt, wigget, material, you name it, we had it somewhere. And you could go there, and it's like going shopping. And so you fill up your basket with all the stuff you need. And so for the model, it's a landscape. You need trees, you know the size, you need the scale, because Doctor Who had a little TARDIS model for model shops. And you know that's okay, everything above that is a jungle, and you make extra things that look weird because it's in a different planet somewhere. Put it all in, a little bit of dry ice in it, and when it's lit, because we made the visual effects of it, or the models of it, as in to the best degree we could. But then along comes lighting, and they light it to the best degree they can. And if there's sound over, sound will lay on a nice woo or whatever. You know, a little smoke in the atmosphere, a little dry ice. And because everyone is doing the best from their different departments, they can create a fabulous scene that looks amazing, when in fact it's on an 8-foot by 8-foot tabletop and is made of paper and plastic and some real little plants in there as well. Yeah. So, you know, it doesn't matter what it is, what component that we're making, like models and things like that. Every one of us was an artist somewhere in our heads. Even the electronics guy was an artist with his electronics. So, yeah, we're right across the board, everything. Even though you'd never done it before, it's your job now, you're getting paid for it, you better do it. And you do. You stretch yourself, you stretch your imagination.
It's something like that when you're told, you know, we need a model shot of a jungle with a few elements. Would you have been sort of shown a design for the studio set, or given ideas and then sort of let your imagination run with it?
It was mostly given ideas. In those days, there was not full drawings coming out of an art department to copy. It was all just, you're given an idea and you're allowed to run with it. And that's why from the very beginning I was allowed to design. No one told me how the talking daffodil had to look or work. I know what a daffodil looks like. I had to use my own brain and create it. Most people were like that, you know. We're asked about, let's see, a spaceship for something, and there's no design handed to you. Maybe the visual effects designer will have an idea, but as an assistant, you used your brain. We were allowed to create ourselves, so that was very fulfilling.
So something like, you know, the amorphous blob, you're given a brief script with a description of it, and would it very much have been yourself, Matt Irvin, Steve Lucas, sort of working out how you achieve that? Because I appreciate the VFX department was full of weird and wonderful props, but that must have been one of the most bizarre, surely. It
was very bizarre. What is an amorphous blob with pseudopodia, you know? So you immediately think of an amoeba and how it moves around, you know, with a little jelly-like tentacles stretching out. But how can you make that? How can you make this thing? What have we got in our stores? Oh, we have meteorological balloons. If we don't blow them up to capacity, we keep them soft and floppy, and then we put a skin over them, they'll flop around and create a jelly-like substance. This is all pre-computers, of course, you know, way back in the dim reaches of time. And so you do the best, and it's kind of successful to a degree, but if we change this, we can make it better, and change that. But then you run out of time because this is television, you're on a budget. And in the end, you get what you get. And sometimes, in this case as well, we're sent back from set on the first day and told to change something to use the next day because that one just didn't work right. Too many people laughed at it. Yeah, it was a tough one. I mean, you're told make a Doctor Who monster, and, you know, it's a man in a suit, or it's a kneeling man, or a sitting backwards man in a suit moving around on a trolley. You know what you can make that's going to be successful because it's puppeteered. How do you puppeteer an amorphous blob? How do you make it first? How do you puppeteer it? You know, it was a very difficult one to do.
And of course, to put that in a cage system set, so it's not as though, you know, you've got a great deal of movement as it is. You then got to confine it, but still have that description. You know, the set can't have helped things either.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. I mean, there was meant to be like a tunnel, a cave or something. It was very restrictive. And for the model shot, I had to make the model of the cave with for a distant shot of this thing coming down. And I used a rubber glove, and I stuck ping pong balls on the ends of my fingers, and then filled a very soft, large balloon with almost a soft stuffing, and put my hand in it and did this coming down the tunnel to make it move. And yeah, it kind of worked, you know. What else could you do? With no budget, or very little, television budget and television time. That's restrictions.
Yourself and Steve actually inside it, operating it.
Yeah, on set it was mostly me, and sitting on a metal bar inside, which was very uncomfortable. So somebody handed in some of the set to me, set dressing, which was bags of moss and grasses. So I piled them up and I sat on them, and I literally sat inside pushing things, the walls up and down. And if the pseudopodia was being used, it was on a kind of handle and articulated. Yeah, and I'd come out and there'd be bugs crawling up me from all the grasses and the moss. Yeah. We gave her all.
If you were given something like that today, how do you think you might approach it differently? Because, of course, techniques have totally changed.
Do you mean for television? Because that's the difference. It would still be done electronically. It would be done totally electronically now. I just worked recently with the same people from New Zealand that did The Lord of the Rings. Well, I'll say recently, it's about 4 years ago now. And so you end up with the characters or even monsters in suits, but with grey dots all over them, reflective dots, and the myriad of cameras around that pick up the movement, and it's all computerized. And that probably would be cheaper than all of us struggling to make this rubber creature, this amorphous creature. I don't know if it would be cheaper or not. There's still a lot of people involved in all of that stuff, but that's how it would be done. It can be done so much more simply now. We've got the creativity of the internet and the computerization and fantastic programs that do all that.
Of course, technology has moved on. And this was the mid-70s when some of the materials we take for granted today were in their infancy, of course.
Yeah. We used to think when all this started, when you could start creating computerized creatures and everything, we used to think, our work will dry up and go away. And of course it didn't, because you've got to start with the foundation of what you need before it's all worked with electronically. So it was actually, we kept going.
So then when you returned to Doctor Who alongside Peter Davison, it was a bit more, I imagine, straightforward, sculpting a hands and head for Gareth Milne's character.
Yeah.
I suppose that would have been more perhaps run-of-the-mill work for you?
You could go from doing something like the Blob to something that was close up in camera. This had to be really refined, really close up, the face on filling the whole television screen. Doing life casts, taking life casts of actors. That was kind of I was the go-to person for that as a sculptor. And I didn't do the makeup, but I would make the life cast. And from the mold, then I would, and the cast of the actor. So I'm making a duplicate actor in plaster or whatever it's going to be. And then I can model in clay on top of that and make all the texture that was needed for Gareth, for example, and then take another mold of that. It gets quite complex with the molding and casting process, and you end up with a prosthetic piece that you then give to makeup department, and they apply it and make it up and make everything look fabulous. But it's got to fit, and that is why you take the mold off the person's face.
And something like that, Gareth was a stuntman, and towards the end of the story, he has to jump off the roof of a building. You were being told, we just want a head and a hands along these sorts of lines, or would you often get the whole script and be able to pick out those key needs yourself?
At the BBC, we could always get a hold of the script. Nothing was restricted. That's not the case in the film industry. So I knew what was going to happen if I cared to read it. And usually we only went straight to the bit in the script that we needed to know about, to see how is this going to work. Is he going to fall in the water and then come out and he's wearing it wet? Now, does it stay on when it's wet? You have to think about all that. So we knew what was happening. I didn't go to set with this. Makeup applied it. They made sure it stuck, and it left my hands once the prosthetic piece was made. So it was it wasn't a small job. They're all complex and in their own way, but it was a very in-house, at the work table thing to do. But I got Gareth, he came in and I made the live cast of him. It was nice to see you'd been interviewing him as well.
Yes, he certainly remembers doing it all. But you mentioned before we were recording that some techniques you'd all trial once, and then you might rely on elements of that later on. So something like Erato, You then have to, for Blake 7, build a sort of pulsating brain. I imagine pulling upon some of your experience on Doctor Who.
Yes. And the size was about the same. It was Blake 7. And a pulsating brain that moved. And then in the end, it really went fast and it had flickering lights just under the skin of it. And then it kind of erupted into green slime as it died or whatever. And yes, of course, because I knew now I could make this. This didn't have to move around the studio, so that helped. It was static, but it still had to be built on a frame. So I built the frame, and then I made. I actually wove zote foam. Do you know the camping mats that people you see rolled up on their backpack when they go camping? That kind of, it's called zote foam, and I used a lot of that. No, I didn't buy camping mats. We went straight to the factory where it's made. And I cut it into strips and I wove, because in weaving, it's a form of sculpting. It's just another medium. I wove the brain shape, the two hemispheres of the brain. And then on top of that, with foam rubber, I just made the kind of sausage shapes of the brain and laid them all on. And then put latex. I painted latex over the whole thing, liquid latex. And now I can remove all that latex as a skin and get rid of, so you can see through it slightly. And then stuffed all the sausages. But the framework was kind of in context with the kind of frame I made or Steve and I made for the creature from the pit. I think this one was with Colin Mapson, but I can't remember. But we decided to use air rams that were attached to the solid foundation that it sat on, crisscrossing up inside the brain, so they would pull and push. And of course, Charlie Lum probably provided all of the electronics, the flickering lights that went in. Yeah, but you take forward what you've done in previous projects and reuse them, adapt them, elaborate on them, and forget about the bits that didn't really work. We're not doing that again. Yeah, it's a big exploration.
I think it's worth pointing out that the BBC visual effects department was mainly male dominated. So how was it coming into all of that then? Because I imagine, you must be one of the few women working there.
Yeah, it was challenging. It could be. I joined in 1977, and at that time, you were still allowed to pay a woman less than you paid a man, legally. And many companies did that. I'd just come from Madame Tussauds, being a sculptor there, and could barely survive on what they paid the women because they paid less than they paid the men. But the BBC said it was an equal opportunity employer and decided for technicians to pay them the same. And so it was wonderful to go there, and suddenly my salary just skyrocketed. I was being paid the same. They expected me to perform to a high degree. Sometimes I found with some designers I had to be twice as good to be equal, because I was sometimes held up to and told, oh, you work here because the government has now said that we must have women represented in the workplace. And it was an attitude at the time, it was just how it was. So you had to put up with it and just get on with it. And it was such fantastic work to work on anyway that I think most women put up with a lot in those days just to stay in the job they loved. And of course, many of the men were just fantastic. It wasn't all across the board. It was so it was a little challenging. Eventually, a few more women joined and things loosened up, and younger men came in and were more acceptable to sharing the responsibility and the acceptance of we're all equal. And yeah, I was, I think, the first one. worked out. That was then. Doesn't happen, well, it was a pleasure to go to the film industry and work in Canada and see an absolute equal sharing, no matter who you were. There was nothing you had to look out for and protect yourself. It was absolute equality.
And whilst in Canada, am I right in thinking you worked on Stargate?
I did, yes. Yes.
How does something like that compare to Doctor Who? Because it's still a strange, wonderful world, but I imagine technology has sort of caught up a little bit to help you.
Yes, but you know what? One of the first jobs I did for Stargate was a little palm thing. It was a device that someone had in their palm and it had flashing lights on it. And I absolutely took my brain back to the electronics things that I'd learned at BBC Visual Effects and then made a little device. And this is something about being a sculptor and being in the film industry with it. When you need to make something that moves, a prop that moves or does things, you don't start with the shape, finished shape. You start off with the workings inside. And when you get the configuration right, this works, now I can make it any shape I want. So you can get smaller and smaller and smaller. So I had this tiny, almost flat disc that stuck in the palm of the hand and yet flickered and had tiny switches on so they could alter, oh, now we want it red, green, red, green is happening, you know, whatever. Yeah. For the film industry, the Stargate, it was you get more information. You get a drawing. So by the time I did that little palm thing, they gave me just a picture of what they wanted, and I got that in there. The freedom of expression, if you like, goes away. You're restricted. There is an art department, and it's designed. The article that's to be made is designed, and you make it. So you change, your creativity changes from being complete creativity to being a technician, a restricted technician. But that, you're still an artist.
Because you still have to obviously realise what is otherwise a 2D image. You know, there's no definition and shape to it beyond that flat image.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, you can pack more into sometimes what they tell you it looks like. And quite often, you know, it doesn't always work. Sometimes you have to go back to them and say, I can make this cheaper for you. That was always the password. You had to say that. You couldn't say, I can make this better for you if we did it this way, or that doesn't really work, can we do it this way? But if you started off the conversation saying, I can make this cheaper for you if, then that was acceptable and you were heard.
And is that a sort of similar experience to film? Because I imagine you've given a little bit more time and money, but all design, I assume.
Yeah. Time and money. There's not always time. I mean, I've had people come to me and say, oh, can we have 500 of these for tomorrow? And you go, okay, tomorrow morning or tomorrow afternoon? Because the time now, you know, and I've made many multiples of things for some programs where Big Friendly Giant was one of them, where we need a lot of those and we need it tomorrow. Say, okay, and because we forgot to order it and it's for filming tomorrow, and you say, okay, I can give you maybe 50 for first thing, another 100 by lunchtime, and the rest of it by 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Will that work? And they work it out, and it works, you know. Yeah. You set up, in the film industry, you kind of get on a conveyor belt mentality as well. Because when the film schedule is made up, it's rigid. And if you fail at producing the goods on time, unless you've debated it up front to say, I don't think we can do that for then, can we change those days around? Then when they all arrive on set that day, they expect it to be there. And if it's not, you probably don't work again.
And have some of those requests been more ambitious, as I think certainly the scale of productions has increased these days, and of course everything's also in high definition. How has that influenced what you've been asked to make?
You have to be absolutely slick in what you're doing. If it's scientific, it's usually very slick. If it's anything else, there's actually breakdown. They call it breakdown, a lot of breakdown going on. And even, like I worked on Mission to Mars, Brian De Palma, and we made full-scale models of parts of the spaceship and small models. But even this brand new spaceship thing had to be lived in. So any components you made, a little paint scratch here and there, a little coffee spill, a little debris lying around, it wasn't always slick and pristine unless it had to be. Once you got into, I did a lot of work for a costume department as well, doing costume effects, because that's part sculpting. I never ran a fabric through a sewing machine. I used non-conventional materials, superhero stuff, metals, leathers, all the rest of it, plastics. And you make it brand new, but then somebody's been wearing this for 5 years, supposed to be, so you break it down, you tear a bit, and it's more than just tearing, it is, you absolutely make it look lived in. So it's not just making a great costume, it's taking it back to how it would be if it was lived in. And it's the same with anything, for any buildings, any weird and wonderful things. Yeah, this is lived in.
Because amongst everything you've done different scale productions in different countries. Is there perhaps one or two that particularly stand out? Maybe they were the most challenging or most enjoyable that really spring to mind?
There's a really weird little film which I love, and I got the best fun out of it. I worked from the beginning to the end, and it was called The 13th Warrior with Antonio Banderas. And it was a real goodies and baddies kind of Vikings, and it was just such fun. And I was pulled in by, it's accidental. I got this job accidentally because someone in Vancouver had heard that I did life casts and could make prosthetic pieces. So can we see your portfolio? And I went in, and I was not a union member. But at this stage, there was so much work in town that all the union members were used up. So I went as they call it a permittee. I'd applied and I was waiting. And they called me in, and the producer was looking at my portfolio, and she said, there's not a lot of prosthetic work here. And I said, no, because I make them and I hand them over to makeup. They do the whole thing. I never get photographs back, but there was one or two bits. And one of them was actually, I did the French and Saunders. Well, I did Don French's muscle suits, and that was in my portfolio. And so was an Albert Finney thing, The Green Man. I had to make in a dream sequence, a man turn into a tree. So I had made a big bark body prosthetic thing. And really, that's all there was. And she says, I don't think we can use you. And I was crushed. And just at that, the art director passed by the door and said, oh, good morning, and walked on, and then did a double take and came back and said, what have you got there? And he looked at a couple of pages from my portfolio, which was full of BBC stuff at this point. And he stuck it under his arm, took my hand and said, you're coming with me now. And I was hired right on the spot, and he took me because they needed, within my portfolio, I had animals that I had made, and they needed these stuntmen to wear bare heads with teeth, and you could see the mouth parts and everything. And I was hired, and out of all the, I mean, we made about 150 bear heads or more for all the extras, but the stuntmen, because they were heroes right in front of camera, they had to be absolutely spot on. And for that, I had a vague drawing from the art department, but they really didn't know what they wanted until they saw it. So I made all the bear heads, and I would go up on the roof of the building and throw them off down into the car park to see if they would withstand all the treatment that they're going to get on set. And they all stood up, no problem, they were fine. And they also protected the stuntmen's heads. There was no crash helmet inside, nothing rigid, but they were protective as well. And I also did a lot of props, molding and casting, and I went on set. They said, oh, we'll send you for 3 days and you can teach the local crew how to deal with all these hero bear heads. So I packed for a week. I said, I know this business, I'll pack for a week. And I got home 10 weeks later. And that was amazing. The experience of that, being with a crew for so long, and you're all away working at the circus. They call it the circus because it's all tents and everything, up a mountain in British Columbia, Canada. And I still have very good friends to this day when we all work together there. And just a fabulous, fabulous memory that I have of all that. It was a great privilege. That was John McTiernan. He did the Die Hards. He was the director. So, and to work with all these wonderful people, just spectacular. So there's a great fulfillment in being able to make the product, work with the product, right to the end of the whole film. And I got a credit. Yay, my first big movie credit. And that was great.
And then did you find that once you got that first big film credit, other things started to just fall into place and the phone kept ringing? Or?
Yes, that's right. At the end of that film, I called the union called me and said, oh, you've done all this, we'll make you a full member. And I had to go and be inaugurated into the union, which was very hard to get into. Some people were waiting years and years, but because I came with all this experience, and so I called the union and said, okay, I'm available for work now. And you wait, and you're in an electronic Rolodex, and when the next film comes into town, they say, oh, we want 20 sculptors, for example, and the Rolodex has gone through it. The first 20 sculptors get chosen. But there was one system where when you were a head sculptor, if you needed those 20 sculptors, you were given 5 and then you were allowed to pick somebody, and that was number 6. And then you had to do another 5 out the Rolodex, and then you got to pick someone else that you'd prefer. And that was a way of ensuring that everyone in the union got work. And I was picked because someone had seen my work. And then that meant a whole bunch more people had seen my work. And I very rarely was calling the union to say I'm available for work. I was actually getting phone calls as one film was winding down and another one was starting up. And very quickly started running the sculpture crews. There was a head sculptor who went to the meetings and dealt with the budget mostly. I also dealt with some budget. But I got to go in very early, even build the workshop. They'd give you a big warehouse and say, oh yeah, we need a Percy Jackson and the Lightning Thief. Here's the space you've got to work in. You walk into this great big, it was an old winery that had closed down, this huge space. I was like, right. And I got an initial crew in, and we set up all the electrics, the power, the water, the drainage, the health and safety, the extraction units and everything. We know what's coming. We're given what's needed for almost the whole movie. And we know how to set up this conveyor belt. And then you start hiring people for what's prioritized. And the crew swells and then it diminishes at the end. But that was, running a crew is incredible. I had 40 sculptors working on that. 40. Can you imagine that ego? Oh my! 40 artists. Oh, it was fabulous. Fabulous.
Well, we touched upon so many things you've done.
Yeah.
There's an awful lot more we could talk about, but I'd just like to say thank you very much for your time, Morag. It's been an absolute joy to ask about just a few of those jobs, so thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. Thank you.